I'm going to start by asking a really obvious question, but how many people here have read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything? You see, I think that's very interesting, because I think that reflects two things. Firstly, that people want to know about climate change and what we can do to fix it. And secondly, that people want radical solutions. What I'm going to try and do tonight is to explore Naomi Klein's book, to celebrate much of it, and and also to offer what I think are some criticisms of it. But I want to say at the outset that while I am going to be offering some criticisms of it, I do absolutely think that everyone should buy and read and discuss Naomi Klein's book, obviously the people who haven't already done so, because I think that what Naomi Klein has done with this book is to put the question of capitalism at the heart of the discussion about how we deal with climate change and what we need to do over the coming years. And that's very important, because it's not been the dominant argument for the environmental movement up until quite recently. Up until quite recently, the debate has been very much around what you might call individual solutions, the changing of personal lifestyles, the changing of how people or groups of people operate within existing society, if you like. And what Naomi Klein does is to drive coach and horses through that argument, to argue that the problem is the political and the economic system, the people at the top of society, the governments that rule in their name, and the bosses and the corporation. And she argues those are what needs to be changed. And I'm going to quote extensively in the meeting from Naomi Klein's book, partly because she's a better writer than me, partly also because I think her words and how she phrases arguments are quite important in trying to understand her wider arguments. A couple of brief points, though, on climate change itself, because I don't think we can underestimate now the threat from climate change. And indeed, one of the reasons that Naomi Klein wrote the book, she explicitly says at the start of it, is that she was sort of shocked into being aware of the scale of the problem. And I think that's very interesting, because I think that's happening for lots and lots of people, particularly those people who are at the forefront of extreme weather events around the world. 2014, last year, was the hottest year on record. That's according to at least two, possibly three independent studies. 20 of the warmest years in recorded history took place 19 of them happened in the last 2 decades. And this year already, the first 5 months of 2015 have been the warmest 5 months on record. And this year is already 0.1 of a degree warmer than last year. Now, the environmental threat we face, while we concentrate in Naomi Klein's book on climate change, it covers other aspects of the issue too. There's a very, very good article in the current issue of the IS Journal, which has just come out by Ian Rappel, about the global species extinction and why that relates to capitalism. It's a truly horrific story. It's more ammunition to those who argue that we need to get rid of capitalism, and I do urge comrades to read that as part of ongoing discussions. We've emitted so far around 560 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. To avoid the 2-degree threshold of climate change, we need to keep the level of emissions within a trillion tonnes. At the current rate of emissions, we will hit that in less than a quarter of a century, around 2039. If that happens, we reach the point when the world's atmospheric systems will start to feed themselves in terms of climate change. Climate change will cause more climate change. Global warming causes more global warming, which could and very likely will lead to runaway global warming that could threaten the existence of life on Earth. And as I said, I think it's the sheer scale of that threat that has led people like Naomi Klein to draw what we might call revolutionary conclusions. Klein notes in her book that it hasn't always been the case, that there was a window, she argues, and I think she's right on this, in the 1980s, when small annual emissions reductions of a few percent would have been enough to solve the problem. She writes, if we'd got serious about meeting that goal immediately after the 1992 signing of the UN Climate Convention in Rio, the world would have needed to reduce its carbon emissions by about 2% per year until 2005. Actually, a very straightforward target had they taken that road in 1992. It didn't happen, and instead what we've had is 30 years of prevarication, 30 years of government rhetoric, 30 years of inaction, and actually 30 years of politicians denying climate change, arguing that action on the environment is bad for the for the economy, for jobs and society. We don't have that luxury anymore. All the latest studies show that we face really, really serious threat from the environment, and a threat that is going to threaten and kill people on an enormous scale. Even the rather conservative World Health Organization report last year pointed out that 250,000 additional people will die annually from the impacts of climate change. And their director, Margaret Chan, said, "Our planet is losing its capacity to sustain human life in good health." Think about that for a minute. Our planet is losing its capacity to sustain human life in good health. That's not a mad Trotskyist sect writing that. That is the World Health Organization pointing out that we are facing an enormous crisis for millions of people. So what does Naomi Klein argue? What the climate needs, she says, to avoid collapse is a contraction in humanity's use of resources. What our economic model demands, however, to avoid collapse is unfettered expansion. Only one of these sets of rules can be changed. She continues, because of our lost decades, it's time to turn this around. Is it possible? Absolutely. Is it possible without challenging the fundamental logic of deregulated capitalism? Not a chance, she concludes. Now, Naomi Klein deliberately uses the phrase deregulated capitalism now, and I'm going to come back to that aspect of it in a moment. But I do want to emphasise what Naomi Klein is saying in those two brief paragraphs. What she's effectively arguing is we need an economic system that is no longer based on unfettered growth. That's a revolutionary conclusion to be drawing, whatever criticisms I may have of how she concludes that argument a bit later on. What we need, she says, is a Marshall Plan for the earth. Now, comrades may remember the Marshall Plan was the economic bailout that the United States did for a number of Western European countries at the end of the Second World War to stop them falling under the influence of the Soviet Union. An enormous pouring of resources into their economies to prop them up. And she argues that what we need at the moment is that sort of economic injection of cash to avoid climate change. I would argue in a very limited way that suggests things like the climate jobs programme that we've been part of suggesting. And Naomi Klein argues in her book very eloquently that by doing this, you face the opportunity to deal with all sorts of other issues in society. Now, just as a little bit of a funny thing here, she also recognises that other organisations in society see the opportunities to arise out of climate change. And she quotes a corporation in the United States. We see expanded business opportunities arising as consumer behaviour and needs change in response to climate change. Now, does anybody want to guess who said that? Which corporation? Expanded business opportunities as consumer behaviour needs change in response to climate change? No, I haven't heard it. Raytheon. Raytheon make cruise missiles. Cheap laugh. Thanks, Naomi. Right. I'm on the other hand, of course, Naomi, quite rightly, Naomi Klein argues for something very, very different. And when she talks about, I began to see all kinds of ways climate change could become a catalysing force for positive change, how it could be the best argument progressives ever had to rebuild and revive local economies, to reclaim our democracies from corrosive corporate influence, to block harmful new free trade deals and rewrite old ones, to invest in starving public infrastructure like mass transit and affordable housing, to take back ownership of essential services like energy and water, to remake our sick agriculture system into something healthier, to open borders to migrants whose displacement is linked to climate impacts, to finally respect indigenous land rights, all of which could help to end grotesque levels of inequality within our nations and between them. That's a fantastic quote, actually. That's a fantastic vision of how you can use the crisis afforded by climate change to build a society based on a very, very different set of ideas. And one of the strengths of her book is very much that she sees this change coming, not from top down, not from sort of benevolent politicians and the great Pope and the rest of them, but what she sees it coming organically is from mass social movements. Indeed, there's a lovely quote she uses towards the end of the book. Only mass social movements can save us now, she says. And she talks at length about the similarities between the anti-apartheid movements, the civil rights struggles, the suffrage movements there, where she talked about mass movements of ordinary people changing the world in their interests as an inspiration, really, for how we can deal with climate change. And opposed to that, she lines up the worst of those organisations that have done everything they can to hold back action on climate change. There's a great chapter, a frightening chapter about the climate denial movement, which people, I won't have time to deal with it, but it's worth worth having a read, really, to see how their ideologies of the right wing in America particularly is tied in very, very closely to the denial of climate change and environmental threats. Just one figure that is worth quoting, though, when we talk about the role of corporations holding back social change. He points out that the oil and gas companies in 2013 spent $400,000 a day lobbying the United States Congress. That's an enormous amount of cash from the people who stand to lose the most from climate change, feeling they need to do it. Now, Klein absolutely blames capitalism. And her critique of capitalism, I think, is very, very nuanced, actually. It's one that I think is worth exploring. For instance, the question of agriculture, a theme I take up in Land and Labour a little bit. She talks about how the globalisation of agricultural systems has been part of raising emissions of greenhouse gases on the last few decades. But she doesn't do that simply based on, how can one say, a really simplistic analysis of capitalism. Actually, she understands some of the quite deep dynamics of the process. Not that page. This has far less to do with current debates about food miles. Notice the dismissal of the idea of individual action there. It's less about the food miles associated with imported versus local produce than the way in which the trade system, by granting companies like Monsanto and Cargill their regulatory wish list, from unfettered market access to aggressive patent protection to the maintenance of their subsidies, has helped to entrench and expand the energy-intensive, higher emissions model of industrial agriculture through the world. This, in turn, is an explanation why the global food system now accounts for between 19 and 29% of world greenhouse gas emissions. The point of that is what she's saying is it's not that people are eating more or that their diets are wrong or they're eating necessarily too much meat and not enough vegetables. The problem she is arguing is the way the global capital agricultural system has driven and shaped the agriculture system in a terrible environmental way. Now, revolutionary socialists, I say, would absolutely wholeheartedly agree with this analysis, and particularly one that puts the blame on the economic system. And we're absolutely in favour of the idea of mass movements, particularly ones that are geared towards the challenging of the system. I'd like to suggest, though, that this marries quite well with a Marxist analysis of the environment and its relationship to human society. At the heart of Karl Marx's explanation of human society is a discussion of the ecological relationships between humans and the natural world. It's an interaction that has to be ongoing. It's an interaction that has existed for all of human history and all the various different types of human society that we've lived in. And it's one that must continue if we are to continue being able to live on our planet. And for Marx, what makes us human is our ability to labour upon the natural world, to change it in our own interests. Nature provides the raw materials for the productive process, the air, the water, the food and so on that we need, the materials that we need to manufacture and so on. And the way that we organise our production, the way we organise that interaction with the natural world helps to determine wider human society from this. It's something that Marx and Engels wrote quite a bit about over the years. Here's a quote from Friedrich Engels talking about how the role of nature and the way nature is understood changes as capitalism comes onto the historical scene. For the first time, nature becomes purely an object for humankind, purely a matter of utility. It ceases to be recognised as a power for itself, and the theoretical discovery of its autonomous laws appear merely as a ruse so to subjugate it under human needs, whether as an object of consumption or as a means of production. Actually, that marries up very, very well with the phrase that Naomi Klein uses in her book of extractivism, when she describes capitalism as an extractive system, a system that sees nature as something to be grabbed, to be used, to be bought and to be sold. Nature becomes purely the raw materials for production or part of the production process itself. And the way that capitalism sees nature is merely in terms of those either of those commodities or as a space to dump waste, to pollution and so on. And Naomi Klein, I think, describes very well in her book how that process and that relationship takes place. But there is something more to it. You see, what Marx and Engels did when they analysed capitalism wasn't simply to analyse the way the production process takes and how it can degrade and damage the natural world. What they also tried to do is to understand the dynamic of the system and way that makes it particularly destructive to the natural world. You see, all hitherto existing societies have been based upon some way of degrading and damaging the natural world. And it's all, even in much much earlier human societies, there have been environmental crises that humans have lived through and sometimes been part of creating, often on a very localized level and so on. But under capitalism, you get a different process, a different scale and of climate, or the potential for environmental crisis. And that's because Marx and Engels understood, and we argue, because the way production is organised under capitalism is based on what you might call the naked accumulation of wealth for the sake of accumulation of wealth, the drive to profit for the sake of the drive to profit. The difference between capitalism and previous societies is that under capitalism, production is not to satisfy need. It's not to satisfy the needs of individuals, of society as a whole. It's purely for to make the profit of individual blocks of capital and to benefit the ruling class and the tiny minority of society. So capitalism as a productive system itself is inherently anti-ecological. It's inherently destructive to the natural world. And I think that's crucial, and I will come back to this point. It's crucial to understanding why capitalism itself has to be destroyed if ultimately we are to destroy, to save the planet and to build a sustainable future. But there are other aspects to capitalism that Marx and Engels identified and tried to discuss, which help explain how our relationship to nature has been changed and altered over earlier societies. Marx and Engels arguing that we are part of nature. Indeed, they're not above it, as some have argued in the past, but we're very much part of the natural world, as much as we change and shape it as well. And the very thing that makes us human under capitalism, our ability to shape that natural world, is actually taken from us. We're alienated from the natural world. We are broken and separated off from it. We are excluded, and our link to it has been distorted and hidden under the relationships of capitalism itself. Under capitalism, our alienation means that we relate to other people not as individuals, but as part of the productive process. We see them through a relationship through commodities, not through their relationship with each other and so on. Marx talks about the way capitalism creates this separation between the natural world and humanity as a metabolic rift, as the wrenching that takes place as capitalism develops, as people literally are pulled off the land and dumped into the cities, as well as all the other changes that are associated with that, the way that raw materials are moved enormous distances, the way that pollution occurs, the way that we're alienated, as I said, from the natural world. And that changes how under capitalism we perceive and we use and we see nature. Nature for us is now, as I said, a commodity, something to be used as part of the productive process. It's not something essential to our well-being and to the well-being of society. In a very simplistic way, there's no factory or business in the world where the accountant has a spreadsheet with one column labelled nature in it. It's abstracted from our productive process completely. And Naomi Klein takes this analysis. She obviously doesn't begin from Marx, so she has a very similar understanding of how capitalism separates us and breaks us from the natural world. And she develops that understanding into seeing that capitalism is a real barrier to the change that we want. And particularly, she sees the growth of capitalism, the drive to grow, to continuously grow, as a big barrier to the building of a sustainable world. She makes the point that the greenhouse gas cuts that we need, the 80 or 90% reduction in emissions, only sound so drastic. They only sound so shocking to the politicians because we are living in an economic system that completely fetishizes growth and can't imagine existing in any other way. The problem is, I think, is despite this rather good analysis from Naomi Klein and actually the similarities that we might see between our analysis as Marxists of the way the world works and the humanities' relationship with the natural world, I actually think there are some problems, and I want to talk a little bit now about how those manifest themselves in Naomi Klein's book. The first thing is that despite being explicitly anti-capitalist, and we must remember that Naomi Klein comes out of what we call the anti-capitalist movement that began in the early 2000s and wrote some seminal books associated with that movement, and very much would see Naomi Klein as an ally in that struggle against capitalism. Naomi Klein rejects very clearly what she calls vanguard revolution in the book. She dismisses the revolutions that have taken place, the revolutions particularly that took place in the 20th century in Europe, headlined by the Russian Revolution, and she dismisses those as bringing about the change and the ending of capitalism that we want. And I think that she does that for a number of reasons. Part of it is that she associates those revolutions with what took place many years later in the Soviet Union under Stalin and subsequent leaders. The very great environmental crisis that took place in the USSR, which we shouldn't deny took place, the Chernobyl explosion, the destruction of the Aral Sea, all sorts of other pollution and so on. Naomi Klein unfortunately sees those as being fundamentally associated with what she calls vanguard revolutions led by revolutionary organisations, which inevitably she would see as leading to some sort of dictatorship and centralised bureaucratic economy that will inevitably destroy the planet. So in rejecting that, what's she left with? Well, actually, she's not left with very much. And her solutions for the rest of the book, often I felt very disappointed when I read them. And I'd be interested what other comrades read, in part because effectively what happens is that Naomi Klein then looks back at the world that we live in and says, well, it is appallingly bad for the environment now. The way the world is organised is bad for the environment, and it's appalling for the vast majority of the people who live in it. What can we do? What is it about it that we can do to change it and make it a bit better? And I think what Naomi Klein ends up doing then is to concentrate her anger and her fire on the latest stage, if you like, of capitalism, what we would call the neoliberal era, the era that began with Ronald Reagan, with Margaret Thatcher in the late 1980s, the era of privatisation, the era of governments chopping up and breaking up and beginning the breakup of the public sector, the deregulation, the attacks on the public sector, the destruction of laws and legislations that protected the environment and working people. Now, again, we have to be slightly careful here because her critique in some senses is very right. She concentrates, coming from North America herself, on what took place in the United States under Ronald Reagan. And she talks about the way Reagan, who was a particularly obnoxious man when it comes to the environment. It's a great quote. Ronald Reagan says, "A tree is a tree. How many more do you need to look at?" Summing up both neatly his own stupidity and the commodification of nature there. What she does is quite right to say, look, before the Reagan era, before this neoliberal era, before they came and they tried to get rid of all that state intervention in society, they had some really good things like legislation that protected the environment, protected workers. And she admits that, she understands that those had to be fought for and that they often have to be fought for in the face of opposition from big business and so on. She's not naive in that sense. But really what she ends up doing, I think, is to look through the sort of pre-Ronald Reagan era, the pre-neoliberal era, slightly through rose-tinted glasses. Which brings me back to the quote, I remember, for those of you late, you won't understand what I'm talking about, serves you right, the deregulated capitalism. The phrase she used right at the start of the problem being deregulated capitalism, where I think what she really wants in some sections of the book is to have a better capitalism, a capitalism that is better regulated, better protected, has more environmental legislation, has more social justice at its core, has more laws to protect workers and indigenous people and so on. Not things that, of course, we would dismiss in any way. But I think what Naomi Klein misses with this is that regulation under capitalism never actually takes place in the interests of ordinary people. It happens because they want to make capitalism better. They want to make it more efficient at making profits, at accumulating wealth. It's always about making sure that capitalism is better for the bosses and not for us. And if we want legislation that improves our lives or protects the environment, it has to be movements that fight for it and organise it. And I think really, while I don't think she would believe this if you sat her down and talked to it, it comes across in the book almost as though she feels that an earlier capitalism before the neoliberal era was better for the environment than we have today. And in some senses that is true. But what she of course misses is that under all forms of capitalism, there's always been that accumulation, that almost always been that drive for profit to maximise the boss's interests, and that has always had at its base some degradation of the natural world. Then she takes it further. What do you do then if you're an activist who wants to save the planet? Well, really what it ends up doing, Naomi Klein argues, is twofold. Firstly, she rightly argues for state and government intervention, for taxing of the rich to fund renewable energies, for state intervention against pollution and massive fines on corporations that break the rules, for a reduction on fossil fuel use and alternatives, for funding for mass transit and insulation schemes, all those sorts of things that we argue for in the climate jobs pamphlet ourselves, and she's right to do that. The second thing she argues is that the movements that grow up and should be built against the worst excesses of what capitalism is doing to the environment, the movements against fracking, the movements against tar sands in North America, the Occupy movements and so on, which she sees, she collectively calls blockadia. She sees them as groups and movements and campaigns that have blocked and sometimes very successfully held back the fossil fuel corporations. She hopes and she argues that those can then expand themselves to create spaces of more sustainable areas within capitalism. Now, my understanding of how I've read those chapters in the book is they're not anti-capitalist spaces. They're spaces within capitalism, and I think that's a problem. We'll give one little example. She talks about the town, I've never been there, it's called Greensburg in Kansas, I'd like to go there. Apparently it was destroyed by a tornado in 2007. A super tornado, presumably in part fueled by climate change. And she describes how the city or the town was rebuilt on completely new lines, lots of renewable energy, lots of sustainable housing, lots of wind turbines, and so on. And she says that the residents went through a process of transformation as a result of the disaster, rekindling values of land stewardship and intergenerational responsibility that have deep roots in rural life. And she describes Greensboro as being a living laboratory for how society could be changed in a more sustainable way. And I think there are a number of problems with that, and I'm sure people can identify them. Firstly, I suspect in Greensburg today there's still bosses and workers. I suspect that fundamental problem with capitalism still exists. More importantly, I suspect Greensburg is part of a wider global capital economy that will put all sorts of pressures and so on. Now, Naomi Klein acknowledges much of that. She then goes on to say, the shift from one power system to another must be more than a mere flipping of a switch from underground to above ground. It must be accompanied by a power correction in which the old injustices that plague our society are righted once and for all. Unfortunately, I don't think you can build a sustainable world or sustainable groups of world inside a wider capitalist economy. And I think the problem comes at the end of the book that Naomi Klein lacks an understanding of what the force is in society that can fundamentally bring about change. What's the force in society that has the power to get rid of capitalism, but not just get rid of it, to rebuild it and rebuild society in a new way that is organised along sustainable lines in the interests of ordinary working people. Now, I think that the real answer to that question, that force, is the role of the working class. And it's a shame in Naomi Klein's book, while she often refers to the role of labour unions and trade unions in being part of new sustainability projects and all the rest of it, and explores and she celebrates very much the climate jobs campaigns that have arisen around the world. What she fails to identify is those organisations as part of the powerful groups in society that can start to challenge capitalism. And I think that one of the things we have to do now is to argue very much along the lines and very much in the spirit of Naomi Klein's book that we need to bring together what she calls blockadia, those tar sands campaigners, those environmental people, the people who are terrified about what fracking might do to their communities, all those people who are worried about climate change and want to see a better world. We need to bring those and meld those very neatly together with the trade union movement and the working class movement. And we've done that to a certain level. I mean, I'm very proud of the work that SWP members have played in terms of developing and bringing and strengthening the 1 million climate jobs campaign and then helping to inject environmental ideas into the wider trade union movement, but also to help bring ideas of trade unionism into the environmental movement itself. But we have to also go further. And I think deep down inside, I think Naomi understands that we will have to get rid of capitalism if we deal with it. You can't have an analysis that she does in that world of a system so geared to stopping change change on environmental action without knowing that that has to be smashed. Those corporations have to be broken up. Those fossil fuel companies have to be taken down. She argues at the end, and it's a lovely paragraph, it's not entirely an analysis I share, so I'll come back to it, but I think it's a lovely phrase here. We will not win the battle for a stable climate by trying to beat the bean counters at their own game, arguing, for instance, that it's more cost-effective to invest in emission reductions now than disaster response later. We will win it by asserting that such calculations are morally monstrous, since they imply there's an acceptable price for allowing entire countries to disappear, for leaving untold millions to die on a parched land, for depriving today's children their right to live in a world teeming with the wonders and beauties of creation. I think she's absolutely right. The way we will beat the bean counters, the way that we will beat the people who put their profits before the wider lives of ordinary people and the planet that we live in, is by building a movement that can start to challenge them and start to break them. And there is a Marxist vision of a different world. It's a Marxist vision built on a society based on the democratic planning of production, where ordinary people can help to decide what is needed by their society and what needs to be manufactured in their interest, in the planet's interest, and in the long-term future interest. And I think that's something that we as revolutionary socialists can bring to the environment movement, not simply an anger and a frustration at capitalism, but a vision of a better world that is organised along the lines of sustainability. The final thing really to say is, where do we go from here? See, Naomi Klein spoke at a meeting in London at a few months ago, just after her book was launched. It was a very large meeting, a very inspiring meeting. And one of the purposes of that meeting was to start to gear people towards the demonstrations that are going to take place at the end of this year. The latest conference that the United Nations is organising will take place in Paris in December. It will be the occasion for enormous mobilisations. There are calls out already for demonstrations in every capital city around the world on the weekend of the 28th and the 29th of November. And I hope that every single SWP member in this room over the next few months will do everything they can to work with Blockadia, with the fracking campaigns, with the Green Party, with all the environmental organisations, to maximise the size of those demonstrations as much as possible. And then at the end of that conference, we want to have in Paris, in France, an enormous anti-capitalist, enormous protest that says to the people in that conference hall, why will you do nothing for the planet? Why will you prevaricate for another year? Why will you sit back and let people die and drown over the world? And we want to start to use that movement to strengthen our side, to strengthen the forces that can ultimately bring an end to capitalism. I will leave you again with that wonderful quote from Naomi Klein: only mass movements can save us now. If we're to save the planet, we have to go out and build those movements and put at their heart a revolutionary vision of a different world that can ultimately scrap capitalism, put it into the dustbin of history, and build a sustainability for the future.
I very much agree with that analysis of Naomi Klein's book. I think it is probably the best book she's written by far. It's better than Shock Doctrine or No Logo, and it represents actually her breaking from some of the ideas she had in the past, because she was very much associated with the anti-capitalist movement, with a kind of anti-Leninist autonomous part of the movement. And she actually did a talk in which I remember, I'm old enough to remember, in 2000, just before her book was published, No Logo. She was here, and she was at the time she was talking about the WTO, and the big protests against that, and that's part of her background. But in the book, she actually recognises the importance of leadership. She's broken with some ideas on horizontalism, because she realises it's a break on building the kind of movement she wants to see. So she's made some big step forwards. However, she's not a Marxist revolutionary, so she's not going to have exactly the same analysis as us. And the audience she's writing to are not the left. It's the general public. And by that standard, it's an excellent book, and it's very useful in that way. And I agree, there are some, limitations. I think the big limitation, I'm definitely sure that Naomi Klein is an anti-capitalism, and she wants to see the end of capitalism. But I think what's happened is that when she wrote the book, she sort of bottled out and fudged the question, because, at the moment now she's on the board of 350.org, which is a very big NGO, which is actually pushing her book. Bill McKibben was also here. And I think she feels under pressure to not be so blunt about, the need to overthrow capitalism. But also, we need to recognise that if we're going to build a movement, we cannot simply juxtapose the question of overthrowing capitalism with the immediate measures we need to do tomorrow. What we need to do is link the issues, the concrete struggles, with the totality of the struggle against the system. So, fighting for climate jobs, or, for instance, today the government announced it's going to scrap the zero carbon homes target. That needs to be part of a struggle which is linked to the overall plan to overthrow capitalism. And I think this is the bit that's lacking in her book.
Well, as somebody who's been obsessively campaigning for a local railway for 25 years, I'm so pleased that you've emphasised her support for mass transport, as opposed to individualised. I come from Bristol. Goodness me, we have one answer. It's called the bicycle. So I'm really glad. Now, I would like to know, did you invite the RMT? They have had very well-supported strikes on Thursday and Friday this week. As you know, they feel that if these new... And it's only First Great Western that's striking, because First Great Western is going to lower the kind of working practices and safety of the workers and the wages, and also, of course, make the passengers more vulnerable. And I'm wondering if we could send a message from this meeting. I'm really, it's really kind of worrying how people miss the immediate suggestions, like the East Coast Main Line, if you know about it, very successful, public ownership. Tories have given it back to the, to the Virgin or whoever. So I do think something immediate and practical, bus and rail is the answer, public transport is the answer on that issue.
I'm Lewis from the steering group from the Campaign Against Climate Change, and I think Naomi Klein's book has come at an incredibly important moment because, and I really welcome that we're actually having a meeting about it here at Marxism, because the next 12 months are going to be really significant and important for the climate movement, because Martin mentioned that in December we're going to have the COP21 talks in Paris, where the world leaders are going to descend on Paris to try and thrash out a deal. And actually there's a bit of a consensus now amongst climate activists that whatever comes out of Paris, it will be a failure, and it will not actually be what we need to address climate change. And that's not because we're all cynical lefties. That's because if you think about the scale of the crisis that we face, if you think about, by the UN estimates, we need to keep 82% of fossil fuels in the grounds, then we have no hope that politicians like David Cameron, Angela Merkel, Barack Obama and so on are going to bring forward an agreement that will actually take the action we need. Because, you think most politicians have a bad record on climate change. The Tories have an especially bad one. The last Condemned government pledged to be the greenest government ever. It cut subsidies to renewable energies and invested more in fracking. Boris Johnson recently rejected divestment from City Hall in London. And I think this is where Naomi Klein's book really comes in, because you see, I think there has been a shift recently within the climate movement. It's going away from individual consumer approaches to tackling climate change, and more people are realising that we need a collective struggle that takes on the system as a whole. And if you consider the amount of people who have read Naomi Klein's book, you consider the 20,000 people who marched on the Time to Act demonstration in March, you consider the people who have shown interest in the ideas of Russell Brand, these are people who understand that we need to build a movement that doesn't rely on lobbying politicians or for legislation, but actually puts the finger of blame squarely at the corporations and the politicians who protect them. And those two dates that Martin outlined are very important, the 29th of November in London and the 12th of December in Paris. Because you see, on the June 20 demonstration a couple of weeks ago that we saw, there was a fantastic demonstration of rage against austerity and against the system. And one of the best chants of that demo was one solution, revolution. We have to get that anger from June 20th, bring it to the streets in November, and our slogan has to be system change, not climate change.
Hi, I'm from the York branch, and Martin spoke there recently, and I think after that meeting, everyone's read Naomi Klein's book and analysed it and discussed it quite a bit since the meeting. And I think what strikes all of us in our branch is this is the ideal issue upon which to build an anti-capitalist alliance, which then raises people's awareness about all the interconnectedness of the anti-capitalist strike. If it affects the air you breathe, the water you drink, the natural world that you want to go and enjoy your leisure in. And we've had an example in Scarborough where we have a very small group of members who are trying to set up an SWP branch and doing some fantastic work. But Scarborough is quite a conservative seaside town, very monocultural. It's quite a challenge for them. They had a meeting recently on fracking. 100 people came. That's massive for Scarborough, you know. And it shows those kind of issues are really drilling into what people passionately believe and feel about their own environment that affects them on a very fundamental basis, on their children's future, on their health, etc. And look at the women in Lancashire, you know, the kind of Rosie Riveter headscarf ladies who fought that amazing campaign against fracking and have beaten back quadrilla for the time being. And these fights will go on, I think, particularly on fracking, all across the country. And I think if we ally ourselves to those fights in the way we're doing, we'll win people over to how we analyse the anti-capitalist fight and the solution that we all see here and we all agree in this room. Other people will begin to come round to that way of thinking because there isn't an alternative way of thinking that's viable.
Hi. Just out of curiosity before I start, are there any Irish comrades here? Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, I just direct this to you for 2 seconds. We need an energy policy. We need a drugs policy. And if somebody doesn't sit down, even if it's on the other end of the phone and talk to me about it, I'm going to scream. I won't leave the party. I'll scream so loud, you'll have to have a meeting. Right. Now to the rest of you. I'm just going to give you an illustration of why it's necessary to change the system and not just to worry about climate change. We have a situation in Ireland at the moment that we have 16% of energy production is actually from wind. They're aiming to get 40%. And as it is, the actual national grid is unbalanced by that 16%. And to keep that 16% wind running, they have to, in fact, subsidise a gas-fired power station and peat-fired power stations. So they're subsidising fossil fuels to keep wind energy going. Why? It doesn't make sense. Yes, it does. It makes sense because the whole point is profit. And the whole point about the 40% wind is profit. The actual saving in carbon is an irrelevance. And the approach is incredible. You've got a situation where we are paying in Ireland at the moment currently a third more than we need to on every electricity bill we get. And that third is going straight into the pockets of mega wind or into the gas-fired power stations and into the peat-fired power stations that are supporting them. And this is a ridiculous state of affairs. And if you were to go for energy conservation, deep refitting of houses, we would have a situation, and presumably most people here don't know Ireland, but we have probably about 6 big cities, one of which is Limerick. We could get down our energy usage to somewhere close to the city of Limerick. We wouldn't need to produce more power. We could actually produce less. But there's not so much profit in that. If we went for a diffuse energy system, if we went for a system of prosumers, producer-consumers on their own buildings, putting it into a much different and smarter national grid, we could spread the benefits throughout the whole of the population. And yet, you know, it is better from a capitalist point of view to continue with a fossil fuel pattern with point source energy production from mega wind and massive construction of grid, which everybody hates, and they will continue to make their profits, and we're already paying for them.
I think one of the things that Naomi Klein has done most importantly, and I take John's point about the book being aimed at the general public. It obviously is aimed at the general public. But I think essentially what Naomi Klein has been able to do is engage with the left on the question of climate change. I think that's one of the areas in which it's made the biggest impact. Partly people have turned up to hear Martin as ever, but also I think the size of this meeting demonstrates that there's an interest on the left in what is happening around climate change, full stop, but also what's happening in terms of the politics and the movements that are building around climate change. And I think she explicitly set out to do that. It was a wake-up call to the left, both in terms of the urgency of the question and also the left having a role to play, a meaningful and significant role to play in terms of building a movement. And hence, we're here, and we have to take that call very, very seriously. I think the comments that Lewis made earlier are really important. I'll come back to those dates and the significance of this year. A couple of things I want to say is I have a kind of slight difference of nuance. Maybe it's more than that, I don't know. In terms of the kind of, I think the left has a stereotype of the environmental movement, which I think is pretty dated. And I think the stereotype of the environmental movement is that the environmental movement has been largely about individual actions. Now, that doesn't mean to say that that isn't a feature of environmental politics. It has been. But actually, the environmental movement, the one that I've been part of for quite some years, has significantly shifted for quite some period of time. If you think about Climate Camp and what Climate Camp represented, we're going all the way back several years. There has been a radicalism at the heart of the environmental movement. There has been an anti-capitalism at the heart of the environmental movement. I would say a couple of additional things. That doesn't mean to say that all the kind of politics are identical politics. They're not. I would say that there are some very important areas of debate. One is around the question of power. And kind of Martin alluded to it, and that kind of rejection of vanguard revolutions, because within the environmental movement, there's quite a lot of rejection of power. Instead of challenging, dismantling, smashing, the kind of understanding is that you can refuse power, and thus the idea of spaces where you can create alternative, not so much ways of living, but alternative societies. And that is something which I think will grow in terms of a meaningful debate within the movement, because if you look at what's happening in Greece at this moment in time, clearly it is not about creating alternative spaces in which different life. It is about challenging those powers that are going to dictate how we organise and how we rule our lives. Can I just make one final point? The 29th of November that Lewis mentioned earlier, I think we have to do more than just get that date in our diaries. Wherever people organise meetings to build for the March the 7th demonstration that took place earlier this year, those meetings were huge. Hundreds, 50s, people already mentioned the meeting in Scarborough. I think we have to get our act together and start building those meetings in every community so that the turnout on the demonstration on November the 29th in the UK, which has to be one of the largest demonstrations around climate in this country, is one that represents the diversity and the radicalism of the movement that exists right across the board, and we have to be part of building and shaping that.
Yeah, Lewis mentioned about the Tories and their energy policy, but does anybody really think that if Corbyn got elected and somehow became Prime Minister within a year, do you really think that the big energy companies would actually allow him to do anything about in terms of energy policy, in terms of reforming the system? Obviously not. I mean, this is, when Naomi Klein, when you remember Naomi Klein's probably writing more for an American audience where, you still have a massive climate denial movement dominating a large section of the media. So from that point of view, it's quite radical. But, she actually, when she addressed it, she addressed it quite neatly from, when she talks about living it, going to the communities in New York devastated by Hurricane Sandy, and she talks about how how the communities were completely abandoned by the system. They had to actually start operating themselves, and the only similarity I could think of was something like in Newcastle in the general strike in 1926, people started organising themselves. Okay, it was called off after 10 days in this country, but you start to see actually that the what happened. The devastation caused by the catastrophe actually forced people to start. Actually, they had no power. People were trapped. Disabled people were trapped in their homes. So if they weren't on the ground floor, sort of thing, literally, and they were going to. People could have died if the communities hadn't got together. It's quite shocking when you realise, that's where she's coming from. And then she seems to be implying that people need to organise from below, but she doesn't talk about a generalised movement that needs to challenge. Needs to challenge it for a change in society, because if you read read things like New Scientist, it is discussed, but they talk about climate change. Well, the solution now, they're looking more and more at geoengineering projects, like sun shields and so on, seeding the oceans to increase algal growth, to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Stupid, mad things that they're talking about. They're absolutely, and what's the driving force for all this? It's profit. And it's quite clear that, the other contradiction, I think, in her book is that, any way of looking at reformism, if you read her book, she says, we basically have them to have a year or so to really start changing things. after that, if we don't start changing things soon, we will reach a tipping point, and it was not waiting for the next election in this country will be too long even to do that. So in terms of building a movement, it's an urgent question. It's a question now, and it relates to all the other struggles, and it also relates to the struggles about migration and racism and so on. And this is the reason why we have to be involved, as people talked about, in terms of building the climate movement, but linking it into all the other struggles that we're part of.
Hello, I'm from Manchester SWP. Basically, I decided what kind of drew me to socialism is when I discovered the horrors of the meat, dairy and egg industry. And it made me go vegan, which makes people roll their eyes, that's fine. But basically, it's horrible. I mean, it's really bad for the environment, what's happening in those industries. But then I started to realize, actually, there's a common denominator there with the exploitation of animals as well as the exploitation of people in the workplace, the climate in crisis, and that's actually capitalism, which made me realize my instinct was initially to go and be an animal rights activist, but I realized actually need to look at the bigger picture and make the connections and realize actually the problem is capitalism, and that's what needs to be sorted out, not just the problem of animal rights. And then I realised it's important to actually, be a part of a revolutionary party and be organised. And that's what's really important right now, I think, because the climate is in crisis to the point where I don't even really want to have kids because I don't know what the planet will be like. That sounds dramatic, but that's how I feel. And then so I joined SWP because I thought, you know what, it's really important now that we get organised and we get together and we smash capitalism. That's the important message.
Catherine Johnson, Sustainable Hackney. Come and talk to me at the Hackney picnic at 1:00 if you don't know about us. Absolutely, we are not going to deal with climate change unless we deal with capitalism. No question. But we are up against a time limit, and we cannot guarantee that the revolution is going to happen next week. I think probably a big source of depression in 60-plus-year-olds is they thought they were going to change the world in the 70s. We have to do some things now. I'm not going to let you off the hook as individuals, because actually you can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by about 16%. This is an important 16% in terms of buying time. It doesn't have to hurt that much. I've done it myself. Secondly, I think this is about incorporating actions into our everyday life, just the same as we do as revolutionaries. And just the same as we try to make things better at work, in society, in our community, it's about doing it for the environment as well. We can link it to fights, say, for the building of houses, challenge the poor quality of housing, which is actually going to lead to it needing to be rebuilt in 30 years, and looking for energy efficiency. I think if you look at work like prosperity without growth, there's a convergence of some of the immediate demands around how we can tackle climate change with some of the demands, the economic demands which were made by the left in the run-up to this election. I think the prefigurative communities can help us develop skills and experience. And we must absolutely work in the unions and challenge those where workers see themselves as having vested interests in fossil fuel industries, and absolutely support the 1 million climate jobs. Sustainable Hackney, we've got a climate group we built for the climate demo earlier in the year, but it was very small, actually, and we must do better in London. Thanks.
One of the best things about Naomi Klein is she's a self-critical writer, and that helps give us some of the clues to the questions that she poses. And this is especially true when she's trying to identify what movements can change the world. So when she talks about indigenous people, she celebrates their movements, but also says if they're isolated, they're left in poverty, and the oil companies can come along, bung money at them and buy them off. The other thing she begins to talk about, therefore, is that what has been successful is political movements for civil rights or anti-apartheid. But again, she's self-critical. A political change at the surface of society still leaves massive racism in the United States. So then, very tantalisingly, she says what we need is real fundamental economic change, but she doesn't go any further than that. She doesn't identify the force that can do it. Like Naomi Klein, we have to be self-critical as well, because we would say the working class can deliver this, except you've got the GMB union at its Dublin conference voting in support of fracking. Now, at that conference, no doubt, there had to be a political argument about climate change jobs, but that's not enough, because I think that decision was probably informed by the fact that the pensions dispute in 2011 was lost. You lose those sort of battles, you're then desperate to take anything that goes. Part of the answer, I mean, this might be exaggerating it a little bit, is Scarborough. Because when Scarborough were organising their meeting, they didn't just organise amongst anti-fracking activists in the local area, Rydal and so on. They went down to the Plaxton's engineering plant and got a message of support from them. They went to the FBU and got a message of support from them. Having a message of support from FBU when they put out fires in a situation of global warming is quite useful, and it changes the character of the movement because it gives us real muscle.
You see, the biggest and most urgent question is how are we going to reduce our emissions? On the one hand, it could seem quite simple. Leave the fossil fuels in the ground, invest in renewables. This would impact on the situation. Except this is the problem, isn't it? This is not happening. There's been endless talks. They haven't come to the target agreements. And I think one of the things that Naomi Klein does in her book is she shows why that doesn't happen, because how fossil fuels are absolutely entwined in the capitalist economy. On the one hand, how the whole development of industrial capitalism was fuelled by coal and then oil. These then have massive sunken historic investments that therefore are very hard to rip up. If you think about the whole energy, infrastructure, transport, aviation, all these things are based on this historical development. She also shows how the imperative driving capitalism about profit stops the brake as well. She talks about how for energy companies, they have to prove to their shareholders that they have future reserves of carbon. Otherwise, they won't get the investment, they'll get out of business. They have to prove they're not going to run out. This is one of the factors that has led to people looking to much more extreme energies, as called, where you use fracking techniques or the extraction from the tar sands or deep water oil drilling to get, very hard to reach resources. Now, sometimes these are given a green gloss. We're told, oh, hang on, fracking is a little bit cleaner. It is not. So this is about extracting oil and gas that actually are fossil fuels and actually give off methane, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas, So I think we have to think about how we do the different things. You see, it's brilliant that the decision about stopping the fracking in Lancashire, that was due to local protests built up over years in that area, linking with trade unions, linking with movements. We have to have more of that, and it links to how we take on the Tories, because how dare the Tories override local democracy, which is what they want to do. But it also brings us to the 29th of November demonstration. You see, I went to a meeting, a very big event called This Changes Everything. It was inspired by the book. There was about 800 young activists there. And everyone was talking not only about climate, but also about transport and about housing and how capitalism actually fails to provide those. If you live in London, where do you live? How do you get around? All these things. And it was about linking it and saying, you know what? There is a bigger problem here about how the whole system is organised. Market mechanisms can't solve climate change. They can't solve the other things we need in life. How do we link them up? And that's why the task is to bring lots of those different campaigns and groups together in London on the 29th of November. We have to start mobilising now. Not as the very end. That is the beginning of how we build a bigger movement that links as well with areas where we have the power to get the change, like the strikes we've seen, to carry on that and actually transform the whole system and get the change we need now.
I think we should caution against saying that we should just end capitalism and then everything will be perfect. I have no doubt whatsoever that capitalism is a major cause of climate change and other ecological problems, but we've got to admit that we have to change our own attitudes and our own lifestyles before we can actually, after we change capitalism as well, but at the same time, we need to understand that we are part of the problem ourselves. Fundamentally, we take too much from the planet and we ask too much. To have an analogy with working class struggles, when we achieve equality, the bosses will be taken from and we will gain. But in this situation, we in the West are the bosses. We take too much. And in order to raise the rest of the world up to our standard of living, it would not require using the regenerative capacity of 2 planets. It would require using the regenerative capacity of 10 planets. And we've got to realise that while renewable energy is a good thing, we use too much energy and that can't change. There is a fossil fuel cost currently of renewable energy that isn't talked about. There is a fossil fuel cost of producing all the things that we rely on today. And if we're going to save the planet, as it is very, very urgent that we must, we have to change that as well. Thank you.
I don't know, many of us have been involved in the climate movement, the environment movement for years and years, and sometimes I still get inside the environment movement saying, oh, you socialists, you don't really care about the environment, you're not serious, or what have you done? You've done nothing about it. And I think it's really important that somehow, sometimes we actually don't praise ourselves, we don't want to get high on ego, but actually sell the fact that we do things. Not least, I've just come from a conference in Brighton of Unite the Union, the largest union in the country, 1,400,000 members, in a trade union movement of over 6 million in Britain. That's the largest grouping of people organised along collective and similar ideas, policies, anywhere in Britain. It's bigger than anything else when you think about it. But sometimes we underestimate this. Last year's policy conference, Unite was moved to vote overwhelmingly against fracking. Now that is very, very important. I have to say, it was Socialist Workers' Party's members who did that. Sometimes we just have to say it how it is, rather than pretend, hide ourselves behind a bushel or something, lights behind a bushel. The reality here is that we had to have the argument over a very long time, because Unite would be the union that actually organises any workers in the fracking industry. And that's why somebody said earlier about the GMB now supporting it. Well, there's this horrible competition between the two. And the question is, who was in the GMB? There's people in this room in the GMB. Who was in the GMB making sure that policies were put forward to stop the GMB trying to fill the space that we had stopped Unite filling? Yeah, it's very, very important that we do this. The other element is my local trade union council is the one putting the money forward to provide the transport to the 29th of November demonstration in London from Plymouth. It's quite a way away, but because where else do you get the money from to underwrite that? But also, we are going to be putting transport on to the Paris demonstration on the 12th of December. Now, trade unions have the resources to do this, and it's only activists in the trade union movements who get involved with the environment movement and actually take it into the trade unions and do that. So it's not an either-or, and there's not some big gulf. This is all part of the big fight against climate change.
Thanks to everyone who contributed. As always, I think a very useful and stimulating debate. I want to start, though, by reiterating a point I made right at the start. Naomi Klein's book is one of the most important popular books on climate change that has been written in the last few years. And I urge comrades to buy it, to read it, to encourage other people to read it, to have meetings to discuss the ideas in it, because Naomi Klein is under attack. She's under attack from the right in America, particularly. Obviously hate her. They hate any notion that dealing with climate change means dealing with capitalism or the problems of capitalism. And her book exposes this stuff wonderfully. And for all the critiques I have made, and other comrades have rightly made of the room, she does it brilliantly. And she is 99% on the same terrain as us when she argues against the corporations, the governments, and the politicians. And we should celebrate that absolutely. But Naomi Klein's also on the attack from some of the left. And then there's a number of crude of it. You can imagine a sort of crude critique that says she doesn't call for the Revolutionary Party, blah, blah, blah. More importantly, a number of the liberal commentators in the States, and there's an article by John Bellamy Foster in a recent edition of his magazine Monthly Review, which has explored some of this. Some of the liberal commentators say she doesn't really mean to get rid of capitalism, because actually you can't get rid of capitalism. What you need is better capitalism. Now, I think she does end up in that place, but her starting point very much is to try and understand and explain capitalism and to try and recognise that we need an alternative. So I think I want to re-emphasise that, because God almighty, you'll go on YouTube and someone will say, hey, see, Martin Empson says Naomi Klein is rubbish. That's not what I'm saying at all, and people should buy it. And it's only $8.99, so for 20 quid you can get her book and my book pretty much together. I want to then take on some of the other things that came up in the discussion. Firstly, the question of individual reductions of emissions and so on. I warmly celebrate anyone who's trying to do this. My partner will tell you at great length how obsessive I am about recycling, but actually we've not been able to do any recycling in our house for almost 3 weeks, because the bins haven't been emptied, because the council's cuts now mean that the lorries don't come round often enough. So actually the recycling is just getting thrown straight away. And I think in microcosm, that's a little bit of an example of the problem you have under a system that we live in trying to deal with emissions. I'd like to reduce my emissions levels even further. Actually, I'm limited by my ability to do that by all sorts of other structures in society. Naomi Klein herself puts it very well in the book, and indeed several people mentioned the This Changes Everything conference. She was asked at the conference about surely people should eat less meat, and Naomi Klein says, well, I do think people should eat less meat, but actually this is a systemic problem. Unless you understand that it's a systemic problem, you can eat no meat at all and it will make no difference. There's a quote somewhere in the book here where she's talking about agriculture. She says, in short, dropping out and planting vegetables is not an option for this generation. She goes on to say there can be no more green museums because fossil fuel runaway train is coming for us one way or the other. And the example I like to use is, there's one corporation in the world who is responsible for 3.6% of emissions, British Petroleum, BP. That's not 3.6% of emissions year on year. That's ever. 3.6% of those 560 billion tonnes of emissions that I mentioned, that's due to one corporation. And I think there are 4 or 5 corporations that are responsible for something like 80% of emissions. Unless we challenge these bastards, unless these bastards are broken, we are, you can recycle and grow your own vegetables all you like, because it will make very, very little difference. Naomi Klein, again, says this very, very well in her book. Meeting the science-based targets over climate change will mean forcing some of the most profitable companies on the planet to forfeit trillions of dollars of future earnings by leaving the vast majority of proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground. Now, the question for us, and the question we have to engage with on Naomi Klein, is how do you make that happen? How do you make BP or Shell or Exxon or all those other companies leave that money in the ground? Because they ain't going to do it if you ask them nicely, and that's really the problem. And I think that I'll come on to the next point I wanted, and the point I really want to finish off on. Trying to read my notes upside down there. Which is ultimately what this brings up is the question of power in society and the question of the state. And I think this is perhaps the weakness. During the anti-capitalist movement, we came up with this discussion a lot. Some of the comrades who were older and involved in a lot remember that the question of the role of state power in society and how you dealt with that came up a lot. And I think it comes up when you talk about climate change all the time. There's a force in society, the state institutions, that want to stop action on climate change because they want to maintain the status quo. The state in society wants to protect the interests of the oil companies, the status quo and the bosses, and that's what has to be fought and organised. And unless you challenge that power in society, you come unstuck. Here's that quote I said about leaving the fossil fuels in the ground. What does Naomi Klein then go on to say? It will require coming up with trillions more money to pay for zero-carbon, disaster-ready social transformations. And let's take for granted we want to do these radical things democratically and without a bloodbath. So violent vanguardist revolutions doesn't have anything to offer in the way of roadmaps. Now, I would like to see change without blood. I'd like to see it done democratically. But I look at Greece and I see actually what's happening is a barrier, an attempt to stop democratic transformation of society, which ultimately does then put the question back on the onus for all of us. And it's slightly ironic, and people perhaps can feel slightly sad about this, but Naomi Klein does finish up her book on Greece A year ago, I was having dinner with some newfound friends in Athens, she says. I asked them for ideas for what questions I should put to Tsipras, the young leader of Greece's official opposition party and one of the few sources of hope in a Europe ravaged by austerity. Someone suggested, why don't you ask him, when history knocked on your door, did you answer? Now, I've got the luxury of being able to say that, unfortunately, I think, yesterday history did knock on his door and he didn't answer it in the right way. And really that then says, for the people of Greece, but also for all the people of the world who are trying to change the world and want to see a sustainable planet where the corporations don't destroy people's lives, where we don't have to worry about flooding and extreme weather, where we worry about having decent jobs, we have to find how do we build a movement that can challenge that state, that when the question of history comes knocking on our door, we can open it up and say, actually, we want a new world. And that's why the role of the working class is so important. And I return to this point because what the working class has the potential to do in society is to stop the gears of the system. They can stop working, they can make it stop, but they also can build it anew. And this is why I have hope for the future, because every time people fight back, every example that Naomi Klein gives in her book of when people organise, they start to take control, not just of their own lives, not just of the lives of their families, but the lives of their communities start to get organised again. When we went to Barton Moss, when the SWP members went to the anti-fracking campaign at Barton Moss, people didn't want to talk about climate change. They wanted to talk about pollution, about traffic, about how their communities were being destroyed, and that's how they were organising together. And we could then bring to that a vision of a different way of how you organise those movements together. Well, actually, you've got something in common with those Unite members and those GMB members on their lorries, because both of you want safe futures for your children. We've got something in common, and I think that's what we have to do, is we have to have a vision of how you change society, combined with a vision that you can bring together movements of very real concrete things on the ground, which is why the Climate Jobs campaign is so important. And I will finish on this point. The Climate Jobs campaign is not an abstract demand out there to sort of say how things could be nicer. It's about being able to go to workplaces and say, look, you don't need to have jobs in fracking. If we build renewable wind farms, if we have insulation schemes for houses up and down the country, it will create jobs, better paid jobs, decent jobs on a scale unimaginable if you do it through fracking. That's how you build a movement. That's how you give confidence to people to say, actually, I want to vote against fracking at the GMB conference or whatever. It's by giving them an alternative that's actually a real vision. But the task for comrades is twofold. We have to integrate this critique of capitalism in an environmental context into everything we do. But we also have to be out there building the movements. We have to be the ones saying we want to build a better world, but we ain't simply going to wait for the revolution. We want to be the people who build for better housing, better transit, better ways of organising our cities and the rest of it. That's how we will start to create a movement that has a different vision of society. I've waffled on, but I do want to really emphasise those demonstrations at the end of this year and what Suzanne Jeffries said from the Campaign Against Climate Change. If in the run-up to December, every town and city in Manchester, every town and city in the country has meetings that bring together a trade unionist, a Green Party member, an SWP member, somebody from the Fracking Coalition, someone from the local environmental sustainability campaigns. If you have that on a platform in every town and city and said, we're all uniting to go to demonstrate at the COP21 protest in Paris and the London protest, I think you could build a really, really powerful movement. And the discussions that will take place on the buses to and from those demonstrations, as you struggle with the ideas in Naomi Klein's book, will be ones that socialists really, really need to be part of. But you have to also start organising those meetings away. December isn't that long away. And if we want to make those big meetings big, you'll have to get out there and do them really and drive them forward.